The air inside the grand auditorium of Croft Ministries was thick with the scent of manufactured divinity. It was a calculated blend of expensive floral arrangements, the subtle ozone tang from 1,000 theatrical lights, and the collective perfume of 10,000 believers, each wearing their Sunday best. The room itself was a monument to gilded faith, a modern cathedral where God and commerce had merged into a seamless, profitable entity. Massive screens, larger than those in any movie palace, flanked a stage trimmed in what appeared to be solid gold. The seats were plush velvet, the color of burgundy wine, and every surface gleamed under a relentless, heavenly glow. Eleanor Vance sat in the upper balcony, a small, gray figure lost in the immensity of the spectacle. Her coat was practical, worn at the elbows, a stark contrast to the shimmering fabrics and tailored suits around her. She felt entirely out of place, an agnostic in the temple of a false god, but she had to be here. This was a pilgrimage of a different sort, a solemn duty to the memory of a man whose love was the only true miracle she had ever known. Her heart beat a slow funereal rhythm against her ribs, a quiet drum in the thunderous silence of anticipation. Eleanor was not here seeking a cure or a blessing. Her presence was an act of remembrance, a way to look the architect of her ruin directly in the eye, even if he would never see her. Her days were now a quiet routine of stocking shelves at a local pharmacy, the scent of antiseptic cleansers and chalky pills, a constant reminder of the world she had lost. She, Dr. Eleanor Vance, with a Ph.D. in organic chemistry and a career once spent leading brilliant research teams, now spent her hours ensuring bottles of aspirin were neatly aligned. The irony was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. 10 years ago, she and her husband, Charles, had stood on the precipice of despair. His diagnosis, a rare and aggressive cancer, had been a death sentence handed down by men in white coats who spoke in hushed, apologetic tones. In their desperation, they had turned to a rising televangelist, a man with a magnetic smile and promises of a divine cure. They had poured their life savings, every last dollar, into his miracle elixir. She could still feel the phantom weight of the small, worthless bottle in her hand. Still see the flicker of hope in Charles's tired eyes, a hope that had died long before he did, leaving them financially and spiritually bankrupt. A shift in the atmosphere, a collective intake of breath from the 10,000 people below, signaled his arrival. Julian Croft, known to the world as the Prophet, strode onto the stage. He moved with the fluid, unhurried grace of a man who knew the world was his to command. His suit was Italian silk, a shade of charcoal that seemed to absorb the very light around him, making his perfectly white teeth and tanned skin appear even more luminous. He raised his hands, and the crowd rose as one, a wave of adoration washing over him. His smile was a masterpiece of controlled charisma, wide and welcoming, yet his eyes, magnified on the giant screens, held a cold, predatory stillness. Eleanor felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. It was him. Older, wealthier, more powerful, but unmistakably the same man. The same hollow warmth, the same practiced piety. He was a master manipulator, and this auditorium was his laboratory. He was about to conduct his grandest experiment, and the entire world was watching. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. Julian began to speak, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that filled every corner of the vast space. It was a voice engineered for persuasion, each syllable coated in sincerity. He spoke of faith as a currency, of blessings as dividends on a spiritual investment. He used words like, quote, synergy, empowerment, and divine leverage, a bizarre fusion of corporate jargon and religious scripture that turned salvation into a business transaction. Then he turned his attention to the enemy, the world of logic, of science, of medicine. He called them man's feeble attempts to map God's infinite design, a foolish pride that led only to suffering and doubt. With each word, a cold fury solidified in Eleanor's veins. She saw the faces of the dedicated oncologists who had worked tirelessly for Charles, the nurses who had shown him such gentle kindness. She remembered the sterile, honest smell of the hospital, a place of genuine struggle and compassion, and contrasted it with the cloying, artificial atmosphere of this theater. Julian was not just selling a lie, he was desecrating the very concept of truth, mocking the quiet dignity of those who fought real battles in the real world. The climax of the evening was approaching, the moment Julian had advertised for weeks as an event that would shake the foundations of unbelief. He announced his special guest, and a hush fell over the crowd as a side door opened. Escorted by two imposing men in dark suits, a frail, elderly man was slowly helped toward the stage. It was Don Moretti, the infamous, and now terminally ill, head of a notorious crime family. His face, once a mask of ruthless authority, was now gaunt and pale, his legendary power eroded by a disease that no amount of money or fear could intimidate. Julian saw this not as an act of healing, but as the ultimate public relations coup. On live, global television, he would demonstrate that his power was so absolute, it could bring even a king of the underworld to his knees in supplication. Eleanor watched, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. She saw the desperation in the old man's eyes, the same desperate hope she had seen in Charles's. Julian was a vulture, and he was about to feast on this man's soul in front of millions. With theatrical solemnity, Julian placed a gentle hand on Don Moretti's shoulder, his expression a perfect blend of compassion and divine authority. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the tableau for the world to see, the prophet and the sinner, the healer and the damned. Julian leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost intimate whisper that was nevertheless broadcast to every corner of the globe. He spoke of the limits of earthly power, of fortunes that could not buy another breath, of empires that could not halt the decay of a single cell. He mocked the so-called experts in their sterile labs, the scientists with their cold equations who could offer nothing but statistics and sorrow. Each word was a poisoned dart aimed directly at the heart of Eleanor's life, her work, her loss. An image of Charles, impossibly thin in his final days, flashed behind her eyes. He had never lost his faith in science, in the methodical pursuit of truth. He had been proud of her mind, of her work. Julian Croft was standing on a golden stage, turning that beautiful, noble pursuit into a cheap punchline, and the crowd was applauding the desecration. The moment had arrived. An assistant, with the reverence of a temple priest, brought forth a small, ornate crystal vial on a velvet cushion. It contained a viscous, golden liquid, the sacred anointing oil. Julian held it up to the lights, and it glittered like a captured star. He spoke of its divine properties, its origins on a sacred mountain, its power to cleanse, to heal, to restore. He uncorked the vial with a flourish, and the camera crews pushed in for an extreme close-up of the single drop of oil glistening on the tip of his finger. He turned to Don Moretti, his face a mask of supreme concentration. As he moved his hand toward the old man's forehead, the building's powerful air conditioning system carried the faintest trace of the oil's scent across the auditorium. It was a subtle aroma, lost to the thousands of others in the room. But for Eleanor, it was not a scent. It was a chemical signature, as unique and identifiable as a fingerprint. It sliced through a decade of grief and slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind, the brilliant, analytical mind of a research chemist, took over instinctively. It was a sense she had honed over a lifetime, a chemist's nose that could deconstruct complex compounds on a molecular level. The aroma was not holy, it was not mysterious, and it was certainly not divine. Her brain processed the inputs with cold, brutal efficiency. First, the cloying, almost sickeningly sweet top note, Oleander extract, a well-known cardiotoxin, dangerous in high concentrations but used by charlatans for its fragrant, exotic properties. Beneath it, the greasy, inert body of the scent, simple mineral oil, a cheap, non-reactive petroleum byproduct. And finally, the faint, acrid undertone, a telltale sign of an impure refining process. The formula snapped into place in her mind with terrifying clarity. It was the exact composition of the worthless snake oil he had sold her and Charles 10 years ago. The smell was a key, unlocking a sealed room in her memory. She was no longer in the megachurch. She was in her sunlit kitchen, Charles smiling weakly as she opened the bottle, the same false hope, the same poisonous lie, filling the air between them. The entire world held its breath. On the screens, Julian Croft's finger, bearing its drop of golden poison, was just an inch from Don Moretti's brow. The crowd was utterly silent, a sea of upturned faces, yearning for a miracle. The Don himself had his eyes closed, his lips moving in a silent prayer, a man at the end of his rope placing his final bet. For Eleanor, that single, suspended moment stretched into an eternity. The grief and passive resistance that had defined her existence for a decade did not simply vanish. Instead, it underwent a chemical reaction. The sorrow, the anger, the quiet shame, it all fused together under the intense pressure of this final public insult. It crystallized, transforming from a heavy burden into a weapon, a diamond-hard point of righteous fury. The quiet, invisible woman who stocked pharmacy shelves was gone. In her place sat Dr. Eleanor Vance, a scientist, a widow, and a witness. The silence in the auditorium was a perfect vacuum, and the truth was a force of nature about to fill it. She knew, with a certainty that vibrated through her entire being, that her own silence was no longer an option. It was a complicity she could no longer bear. With the chemical signature of the fraud seared into her consciousness, the world around Eleanor Vance seemed to slow to a crawl, each frame of reality rendered with excruciating detail. She saw the ecstatic, tear-streaked face of a woman in the row below, her hands clasped in prayer, completely oblivious to the poison being presented as a sacrament. She saw Julian Croft's face on the enormous screen, a mask of beatific concentration, his brow furrowed in a pantomime of divine effort, a performance so polished it was indistinguishable from reality for the 10,000 souls captivated by it. She saw the frail, trembling hand of Don Moretti, a man who had likely ordered the deaths of others without a second thought, now reaching for a lie with the desperation of a drowning man. In that suspended moment, the 10 years of silent, gnawing grief inside her did not simply ignite. It underwent a profound molecular transformation, changing its very state from a heavy, liquid sorrow into a solid, crystalline structure of pure, unyielding purpose. The image of Charles, his skin stretched thin over his bones, but his eyes still full of love for her, superimposed itself over the gaudy spectacle on stage, and she knew that her silence was a betrayal of that love, a betrayal of the truth he had so cherished. A force that felt external to her own will began to move her body. It started in her core, a deep, resonant hum of certainty that traveled through her limbs, pushing her upward. The worn fabric of her coat rustled softly, a sound completely lost in the cavernous silence of the auditorium, yet to her, it was as loud as a thunderclap. She rose from her seat, a singular vertical motion in a sea of transfixed onlookers. A few heads turned in the rows immediately around her, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and curiosity, but she did not see them. Her entire being, every ounce of her focus, was locked onto the man on the stage. Her posture was no longer that of a weary, invisible woman. It was the posture of a scientist about to present a finding, erect, steady, and irrefutable. Her lungs filled with the tainted, recycled air of the auditorium, and for the first time in a decade, it did not feel suffocating. It felt like fuel. The quiet, unassuming pharmacist's assistant was gone, and in her place stood Dr. Eleanor Vance, returned from a long and painful exile. ready to reclaim her voice from the man who had stolen everything else. The sound that left her lips was not a scream of rage or a cry of grief. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the precise, unwavering clarity of a laboratory instrument. Her voice, though unamplified, was pitched to cut through the heavy, expectant air, carrying across the rows of seats with astonishing power. "That's not holy water," she declared, the words sliced through the reverent hush, instantly shattering the carefully constructed illusion. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd as heads swiveled, trying to locate the source of the sacrilege. On stage, Julian Croft froze, his fingers still hovering a millimeter from Don Moretti's skin. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of pure, animal annoyance crossed his features, visible only on the massive close-up screens, before the mask of piety snapped back into place. He had not yet processed the content of her words, only the insolence of the interruption. But Eleanor was not finished. She took another breath, her resolve hardening with every passing microsecond, drawing strength from the memory of a decade of injustice. She let the second part of her accusation fly, each word a carefully aimed projectile. "That's mineral oil and oleander." The specificity of the claim was a different kind of weapon. It wasn't a vague heckle, it was a diagnosis. The words, foreign and scientific, hung in the air, creating a new layer of confusion. Then came the final devastating blow, the one that carried the full weight of her personal history and transformed a chemical accusation into a human tragedy. Her voice cracked, just for a moment, with the pain of 10 years, but it lost none of its strength. "The same poison you sold my husband before he died." That was the sentence that landed. It recontextualized everything. She was not a random heckler, she was a witness. She was not a doubter, she was a victim. The auditorium, which had been suspended in a moment of manufactured holiness, erupted into a cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and shouts. The spell was broken, the fragile bubble of belief punctured by a shard of undeniable, personal truth. On the stage, Julian Croft's world tilted on its axis. The live global feed was broadcasting his moment of supreme triumph, and this unknown woman, this ghost from a past he had long since buried under mountains of cash, had just turned it into a nightmare. His mind, usually a finely tuned machine of manipulation and crowd control, short-circuited. He stared out into the darkness of the upper balcony, trying to locate her, his eyes, magnified 1,000 times on the screens, now burning with a cold, reptilian fury that his practiced smile could no longer conceal. Don Moretti's eyes snapped open. The desperate hope was gone, replaced by the shrewd, calculating gaze that had made him a king in the underworld. He looked from Julian's suddenly tense face to the drop of golden oil on his fingertip, and then back again. He had built an empire on sniffing out deception, and the stench of it was now overpowering. The miracle had evaporated, leaving only the raw, ugly mechanics of a con exposed for the world to see. Julian recovered in seconds, his survival instincts honed by years of navigating scandals and fending off critics. He couldn't address the substance of her claim. To do so would be to give it legitimacy. He had to destroy the source. He turned back to the microphone, his voice no longer a soothing baritone but a sharp, commanding roar. "Brothers and sisters, do not be deceived," he thundered, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger toward the balcony. "The forces of darkness are always at work, seeking to sow doubt and discord in the hearts of the faithful. We are witnessing a demonic attack, live, in God's own house." He was turning her into the enemy, a theological scapegoat. The crowd, desperate to have their faith restored, swayed with his words, their confusion beginning to curdle into anger directed not at him, but at her. He had seized control of the narrative, recasting himself as the victim of a spiritual assault. His face, contorted into a mask of righteous indignation, filled the screens. This is what the enemy does. He sends his agents, his faithless hecklers, to disrupt the work of the Lord. The words were a dog whistle to his most fervent followers, a call to arms against the non-believer in their midst. He then dropped the pretense of spiritual warfare and let his raw corporate fury show. "Security!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "Remove that agent of darkness from this holy place. Remove her now." The command echoed through the auditorium, a royal decree from a king whose authority had been challenged. The crowd, now a unified mob, turned toward Eleanor, their faces a mixture of fear and hostility. They saw her not as a grieving widow, but as the serpent in their garden, the physical manifestation of the doubt Julian had just commanded them to cast out. Two massive men in identical black suits who had been standing impassively by the stage began to move with unnerving speed and efficiency. They ascended the side stairs to the balcony, their movements fluid and practiced. The crowd parted for them like water before the hull of a ship. They were the enforcers of Julian's will, the physical arm of his ministry. Eleanor watched them approach, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a strange, exhilarating sense of completion. She had said what she needed to say. The truth was out in the world, a living thing now, independent of her. She did not resist as they reached her, their hands gripping her upper arms with a force designed to intimidate and inflict pain. They were professionals, and their faces were blank, devoid of any emotion as they began to haul her from her seat, their grip bruising her skin through the thin fabric of her coat. As they dragged her along the aisle, she was forced to look into the faces of the people she passed. They were filled with a chilling blend of pity and contempt. An elderly woman made the sign of the cross as she passed, as if to ward off her evil influence. A young man hissed, "Blasphemer," under his breath. They were all victims, just as she and Charles had been, but they did not know it yet. They were defending the architect of their own deception. Yet here and there she saw a different expression, a flicker of uncertainty in a young woman's eyes, a man whose brow was furrowed in thought, not anger. The seed of doubt, she realized, had not been planted in just one mind, but in thousands. Her public humiliation might be the very thing that saved some of them from a private one. Her last glimpse of the stage was a tableau frozen in her memory. Julian Croft was attempting to salvage the moment, his hand now placed on Don Moretti's shoulder in a gesture of protective solidarity. But the Don was not playing along. The old mafioso had pulled away slightly, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on Julian with a look of pure, unadulterated ice. It was the look of a predator who has just realized he is in a cage with another, more treacherous predator. In that single, silent exchange, Eleanor knew that Julian had made a far more dangerous enemy tonight than just a grieving chemist. He had tried to con a con man, and the consequences of that miscalculation were only just beginning to unfold. The power of faith was nothing compared to the power of a vengeful crime syndicate that felt it had been publicly disrespected. The heavy, soundproof doors of the auditorium slammed shut behind her, and the roar of the crowd was instantly cut off, replaced by the sterile, humming silence of a brightly lit corridor. The transition was jarring, like being violently ejected from one reality into another. The two security guards did not speak. They continued to drag her down the plushly carpeted hall, past framed portraits of Julian Croft smiling benevolently, a constant, mocking reminder of his omnipresence in this place. They shoved her through a final set of doors, and suddenly she was outside, stumbling into the cold, damp night air. The shock of the temperature change made her gasp. One of the guards gave her a final, contemptuous shove, sending her sprawling onto the hard, unforgiving concrete of the sidewalk. "Stay away from here," one of them grunted, his voice flat and menacing, before they turned and disappeared back inside the temple. She lay there for a moment, the rough texture of the pavement pressing against her cheek, the distant sound of city traffic the only noise. A sharp pain radiated from her shoulder where she had landed, a dull, physical ache that was a pale echo of the deeper ache in her soul. The adrenaline that had fueled her began to recede, leaving behind a vast, empty space that was quickly filled with a crushing wave of despair. What had she actually accomplished? She had spoken her truth for 30 seconds, and for that, she had been brutalized and cast out like refuse. Julian Croft was still in there, on his golden stage, surrounded by 10,000 adoring followers and millions more watching at home. He would spin this, twist it, and use it to his advantage, painting himself as a martyr attacked by the forces of evil. She was just one woman, with one story, against a multi-billion-dollar empire of lies. The sheer, insurmountable scale of it all washed over her, and for the first time that night, she felt the hot sting of tears welling in her eyes. The image of Charles returned to her, but this time it wasn't the sick, frail man in the hospital bed. It was Charles in his prime, in their university lab, his face alight with the thrill of discovery. He was leaning over a microscope, and he looked up at her, his smile wide and genuine. "The data never lies, Elle," he had told her once, after a rival tried to discredit their research. "People lie, egos lie, money lies. But the data, the pure, unvarnished data, will always lead you to the truth. You just have to trust it." His voice, so clear in her memory, was an anchor in the swirling sea of her despair. He had believed in evidence. He had believed in proof. And he had believed in her brilliant, analytical mind. Lying on the cold concrete, humiliated and alone, she realized he was right. Her testimony was not enough. Her story was not enough. She needed data. A cold resolve, far more powerful than the initial burst of righteous fury, began to settle deep within her bones. The tears dried on her cheeks. This was not the end, it was the beginning. She was a scientist. Her field of battle was not in a theater of faith, but in a laboratory of facts. Julian Croft had built his empire on smoke and mirrors, on charisma and carefully crafted illusions. She would dismantle it with gas chromatography, with mass spectrometry, with financial records, and with the inescapable elemental power of the truth. She pushed herself up, first to her knees and then to her feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in her shoulder. She brushed the grit from her coat, a simple, symbolic act of defiance. She was not the dirt he had thrown her into, she was the force that would bring his gilded temple crashing down. That was quite a performance. The voice came from the shadows near the building's entrance. A young man stepped into the light, holding a reporter's notebook and a pen. He looked to be in his late 20s, with a skeptical, intelligent glint in his eyes that she recognized instantly. He wasn't a believer. He was an observer. "I'm Ben Carter, with the Chronicle. I was inside, covering the spectacle." He gestured vaguely toward the building. "Most hecklers just shout Bible verses. You named chemical compounds. That got my attention." He looked her up and down, taking in her disheveled state, his expression not of pity, but of intense professional curiosity. He saw a story, a real one, lying just beneath the surface of the night's bizarre events. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. She saw the ambition in his posture, the hunger for a career-making story. But she also saw something else, a genuine skepticism, a desire to uncover what was real. In a world of blind faith, a healthy dose of doubt was a powerful tool. She could not do this alone. She needed access. She needed a platform. She needed someone who knew how to navigate the world of media and public opinion. He was a means to an end, but he might also be an ally. "It wasn't a performance," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of the emotion from before. "It was a testimony, and every word of it was true." Ben Carter took a step closer, his pen poised over his notebook. "Mineral oil and oleander extract," he repeated, testing the words. "You're sure about that? That's a very specific, very serious accusation to make on live television against a man like Julian Croft." He was probing, testing her credibility, looking for any hint of instability or delusion. He needed to know if she was a reliable source or just another crackpot with a grudge. This was the moment that would determine everything. Her response had to be as precise and as convincing as her initial accusation. "I have a PhD in organic chemistry," Eleanor stated plainly, meeting his gaze without blinking. For 20 years, I was a lead research scientist at Sterling Pharmaceutical. My husband Charles and I bought that exact same fraudulent mixture from Julian Croft 10 years ago, when he was just starting out, operating from a rented storefront. The money we gave him, our entire life savings, helped build that palace in there. She pointed a thumb back at the auditorium. I didn't just guess the ingredients, Mr. Carter. I recognized the chemical signature. I know his poison, because I lived with it. I held it in my hands as my husband died. The sheer, unshakable authority in her voice hit Ben Carter with the force of a physical blow. This was no crazed fanatic. This was an expert witness. This was the key that could unlock the entire Croft empire. He clicked his pen. "Okay, Dr. Vance," he said, the honorific a sign of his newfound respect. "You have my attention. But your word, even with your credentials, won't be enough to take him down. You know that, right? We need proof. Hard, irrefutable proof." "I know," Eleanor replied, a faint, determined smile touching her lips for the first time. "That's why you and I are going to get it." They stood under the cold glow of a street lamp, an unlikely alliance forged in the shadow of a fraudulent empire. The disgraced scientist and the hungry journalist. The first step was clear in her mind. They needed a sample of that so-called sacred anointing oil. Croft Ministries, in its infinite greed, made that part easy. They sold it on their website, packaged in ornate bottles for $100 apiece. They would buy his lie, ship it to a lab, and let the data do the talking. While Ben placed the order on his phone right there on the sidewalk, Eleanor's mind was already 3 steps ahead, racing through her network of old contacts. Most would have forgotten her, or would be too afraid of the professional repercussions of getting involved. But there was one name that surfaced from the depths of her memory: Dr. Eris Thorne. He was a brilliant, if notoriously cantankerous, analytical chemist at her old university. Eris was a purist, a man who despised scientific fraud with a religious fervor. He valued integrity above all else and had a healthy disdain for corporate politics. If she could convince him, he had access to a mass spectrometer that could provide a definitive, court-admissible analysis of the oil's composition. She found his number still saved in her old phone's contact list, a digital ghost from a life she thought was over. Her thumb hovered over the call button, a wave of hesitation washing over her. To make this call was to fully step back into the world that had, in many ways, broken her. It was to admit how far she had fallen, to ask for a favor from a position of weakness. But then she thought of Charles, and the hesitation vanished, replaced by the same cold resolve that had propelled her to her feet in the auditorium. She pressed the button, the electronic tone of the ringing phone sounding like a bell signaling the start of a new round in a fight she had been losing for a decade. The voice that answered was exactly as she remembered, gruff, impatient, and sharp as a tack. Thorne. There was no greeting, just the clipped statement of his name. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Eris," she began, her voice steady. "It's Eleanor Vance." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. A silence so profound she thought he might have hung up. Then his voice returned, a shade softer, laced with surprise. "Vance? My God, I haven't heard that name in years. I heard you left the field. What in the world do you want?" She explained everything, starting with Charles, the original elixir, and ending with the spectacle she had just witnessed and disrupted. She laid out her suspicions with the calm, methodical language of a scientist proposing a hypothesis. She didn't plead or appeal to emotion. She presented him with a problem that she knew his mind, his very nature, would be unable to resist. A brazen act of chemical fraud being passed off as a divine miracle. She could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the professional offense warring with his natural caution. When she finished, there was another long silence. "Croft?" Eris finally grumbled, the name tasting like something foul in his mouth. "That charlatan. I've seen his commercials, makes my skin crawl." He paused again. "You're sure it's the same stuff, oleander?" That's not just fraud, Eleanor. That's reckless endangerment. It's a cardiotoxin. He didn't need any more convincing. The integrity of his entire profession had been insulted. "Get me a sample," he said, his voice now filled with a grim energy. "Unopened, in its original packaging. I'll run it through the GCMS myself, off the books. And Eleanor, welcome back to the fight." As she ended the call, a profound sense of relief washed over her. She was no longer alone. She had an ally with the tools she needed. Across from her, Ben Carter looked up from his phone, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "While you were reconnecting with old friends," he said, "I was doing a little digging of my own. Guess who the sole supplier of exotic oils and essences is for Croft Ministries' entire product line? A shell corporation called Sacred Provisions LLC, registered to a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands. There's no factory, no office, no employees. Just a paper trail designed to move money." Eleanor looked from the journalist's determined face to the glowing edifice of Croft Ministries, a monument to a lie that had stood unchallenged for far too long. They had the scientific angle, and now they had the first thread of the financial one. The sample of the oil was on its way. The lab was waiting. The plan was no longer a desperate hope born of grief and rage. It was a concrete strategy, a multi-front assault on Julian Croft's empire of deceit. For the first time in 10 years, the future was not a bleak expanse of quiet survival, but a battlefield on which she was finally equipped to win. The investigation had begun. The package arrived 3 days later, a small, unassuming cardboard box that contained the heart of a multi-billion-dollar lie. Eleanor handled it with the detached precision of a bomb disposal expert, her movements economical and sure. Inside, nestled in a bed of cheap wine-colored satin, was the crystal vial. It was heavier than she expected, designed to feel substantial, to convey a sense of ancient importance. The golden liquid within caught the dim light of her small apartment, shimmering with a false promise. The label was a masterpiece of marketing, embossed with gold foil and featuring an ethereal logo of a dove ascending into a sunburst. "Sacred anointing oil," it proclaimed in an elegant, flowing script. "Ingredients sourced from the Holy Land. Blessed by the Prophet." Eleanor felt a cold, humorless smile touch her lips. The only thing this vial contained was the distilled essence of Julian Croft's boundless avarice, and she was about to give it a voice. She placed it carefully into a padded case, the same kind she used to transport sensitive lab samples in her former life. The familiar weight of the case in her hand was a comfort, a tangible link to the woman she used to be, the woman she was now, once again, becoming. Dr. Aris Thorne's laboratory was the antithesis of Croft's auditorium. It was a temple of a different kind, one dedicated to empirical, unforgiving truth. There was no gold trim or velvet seating, only stainless steel countertops, the complex filigree of glass beakers and distillation columns, and the steady, reassuring hum of ventilation fans. The air smelled of ozone and cleaning solvents, a scent of sterile honesty that Eleanor inhaled like a long-lost perfume. Aris Thorne himself had not changed in a decade. He was a stooped, wiry man with a shock of unruly white hair and eyes that peered out from behind thick glasses with an expression of permanent, intellectual dissatisfaction with the universe. He greeted her with a grunt, taking the padded case from her without ceremony. He did not ask about her life, her grief, or her plans. He was not interested in the human drama. He was interested in the data. He saw the vial, his lip curling in a faint sneer of academic disgust. He handled it with a pair of forceps, as if it were contaminated not just chemically, but morally. To him, this was not just a con, it was a perversion of science, an insult to the very principles of rational inquiry that governed his life. He led her to the heart of the lab, to a large beige machine that occupied a place of honor against one wall, the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. To the uninitiated, it was an unimpressive box, covered in blinking lights and connected to a computer monitor. To Eleanor and Aris, it was an oracle. It was a machine that could take any substance, vaporize it, and break it down into its fundamental molecular components, rendering a verdict that was absolute and unappealable. Eris worked with a practiced, almost reverent efficiency. He drew a minuscule sample of the golden oil with a syringe, his hands, though wrinkled with age, as steady as a surgeon's. He injected the sample into the machine, his movements precise and deliberate. With a few keystrokes, the analysis began. The machine whirred to life, its internal pumps humming a low, monotonous song. They both stood in silence, watching the monitor, waiting for the lie to be unraveled. For Eleanor, this was the crucible. Her memory, her senses, her entire case rested on what this machine would reveal. The image of Charles, trusting her judgment, filled her mind, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. The first results began to scroll across the screen, a series of peaks and valleys appearing on a digital graph. It was a chemical fingerprint, unique and irrefutable. Eris leaned closer, his gruff demeanor melting away, replaced by the focused intensity of a predator closing in on its prey. "There," he muttered, tapping a blunt finger against the screen. "A massive peak for the C15 to C40 range. Aliphatic hydrocarbons. It's as clean a signature for mineral oil as I've ever seen. Cheap, industrial grade by the looks of it." He typed a few more commands, refining the data. Then, a second set of peaks emerged, smaller but distinct, with a more complex structure. He stared at them for a long, silent moment, cross-referencing the molecular weight against a vast digital library in the system's memory. A name finally flashed on the screen next to the peak: oleandrin. Eris leaned back, a grim look of satisfaction on his face. "Well, I'll be damned, Vance," he said, his voice a low growl. "You called it. Mineral oil and a cardiac glycoside. This isn't just snake oil, it's poison. In the right dose, this could cause arrhythmia, nausea, even death in a compromised individual." Eleanor felt no triumph, only a profound, hollow validation. The data did not lie. The screen in front of her was the ghost of her husband's hope, rendered in green and black. It was the physical proof of the lie that had unraveled their lives, the lie that was still being sold to millions of desperate people around the world. Eris printed the results, the pages emerging from the laser printer with a quiet whir. He stamped each one with an official university seal and signed the final page with a flourish, his signature a jagged, angry scrawl. "There," he said, handing the stack of papers to her. "That's your weapon. It's court admissible. Go slay your dragon." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond scientific curiosity in his eyes. It was respect. "It's good to have you back in the lab, Eleanor," he said quietly. It was the highest praise he was capable of giving, and it meant more to her than any award or accolade she had ever received in her past life. She was a scientist again, armed with irrefutable facts. Meanwhile, Ben Carter was hunting a different kind of prey. He worked from a cramped cubicle at the Chronicle, an island of chaotic energy in a sea of quiet desperation. His desk was a collage of coffee-stained legal pads, discarded takeout containers, and printouts of financial documents. He was a digital bloodhound, chasing a paper trail that had been deliberately designed to disappear. The shell corporation, Sacred Provisions, LLC, was a dead end, a phantom entity in the Cayman Islands, but Ben knew that even ghosts leave a trace. He spent 3 sleepless days and nights diving into shipping manifests, import-export databases, and corporate registration archives. He was looking for a link, a single tangible connection between the Cayman ghost and a real-world entity. He found it in an obscure customs declaration for a bulk shipment of industrial-grade mineral oil, imported from China to a chemical supply warehouse in New Jersey. The purchaser on the manifest was not Sacred Provisions, but another company, a small, domestic LLC named Apothecary Associates. This was the first loose thread. Ben pulled on it, and the entire tapestry of Croft's financial empire began to unravel. A search of Apothecary Associates' corporate filings revealed a single director, a man named Gerald Finney, A quick background check showed that Gerald Finney had been the chief financial officer of a small, family-owned botanical extract company in Oregon until 2 years ago, when the company had been aggressively acquired and then dismantled by a larger, unnamed conglomerate. The conglomerate, Ben discovered after another 12 hours of digging through layers of holding companies, was owned by the investment arm of Croft Ministries. They hadn't just bought the company, they had gutted it, sold off its assets, fired all its employees, and kept only one thing: its chemical supply chain and its lead chemist. Gerald Finney had been left with nothing but a grudge and a deep, intimate knowledge of how Julian Croft moved his money. Ben knew he couldn't approach a man like Finney through official channels. He found a personal email address through an old university alumni network and sent a carefully worded message, mentioning only Apothecary Associates and shared interests. To his surprise, a reply came back within the hour. 2 words: Black Rose Tavern, 10 p.m. The tavern was a dark, anonymous dive bar in a forgotten part of the city, the kind of place where secrets were currency. Gerald Finney was a ghost of a man, thin and pale, with nervous eyes that constantly scanned the room. He looked less like a former CFO and more like a man who had been running for his life for 2 years. He listened to Ben's pitch, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a glass of whiskey. He had been bound by a draconian non-disclosure agreement, but the sight of Croft's face on television using the very oleander extracts his old company had perfected for perfumes to peddle a miracle cure had corroded his fear, replacing it with a simmering rage. He didn't say much, he simply slid a small encrypted USB drive across the sticky table. "This is everything," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The real books. The offshore accounts in Panama and Zurich. The transfers from the ministry's donation funds directly into Croft's personal accounts to pay for his jet, his mansions, his art collection. He called it divine compensation. The man doesn't have a ministry, he has a hedge fund with a crucifix on top." Finney looked Ben dead in the eye, a desperate plea mixing with the anger. "You didn't get this from me. The man is not just a thief, he's a monster. The people who have tried to expose him, they have a habit of disappearing. Be careful." With that, he drained his whiskey, stood up, and vanished into the night, leaving Ben alone with a digital key that could either win him a Pulitzer or get him killed. He clutched the drive in his hand, the small piece of plastic feeling as heavy as a block of granite. Back in her apartment, which had become their makeshift war room, Eleanor and Ben plugged the drive into his laptop. The screen filled with spreadsheets, bank statements, and internal memos, a labyrinth of numbers and legal jargon that documented a decade of systematic, breathtaking fraud. They saw the initial seed money, small deposits from thousands of desperate people like Eleanor and Charles, flowing into an account that was then used as collateral to build the first church. They saw the money from the collection plates, millions of dollars in untraceable cash, being funneled through Apothecary Associates, which purchased the cheap chemicals, bottled them as sacred oil, and then sold them back to the ministry at a 1,000-fold markup, laundering the donations into, quote, business expenses. The profits were then wired to the offshore accounts, an untouchable fortune built on the suffering of the sick and the dying. The scale of it was staggering, a masterpiece of financial deception. As they sifted through the cold, hard data, Eleanor felt a new kind of anger, one that was different from the sharp, personal grief she had carried for so long. This was a systemic crime. Croft hadn't just scammed her. He had weaponized faith itself, turning it into an industrial-scale engine for extracting wealth from the most vulnerable members of society. She thought of the faces in the crowd, the people who had looked at her with such contempt as she was dragged away. They were not just believers. They were the raw material for his empire, their hope, the fuel he burned to power his private jet. The fight was no longer just for Charles. It was for every single person who had ever dropped $1 into a collection plate, believing they were investing in salvation when they were only padding the portfolio of a sociopath. The scientific proof and the financial records were a powerful combination, an intellectual one-two punch that would decimate Croft in a court of law or in the court of public opinion. But Eleanor knew they were missing a crucial third element: the human cost. Data and spreadsheets were abstract. To truly make the world understand the depth of Croft's depravity, they needed to show the faces of his victims. They needed to give a voice to the silent suffering he had left in his wake. Ben, using the ministry's own donor lists from the leaked files, began the painstaking and heartbreaking process of cross-referencing names with public obituaries and hospital records. He started making calls, his journalistic bravado softening into a gentle, compassionate tone as he spoke to families who had lost everything. At first, no one wanted to talk. The shame was too great, the memory too painful. Some still clung to the belief that their loved one's faith simply hadn't been strong enough. A cruel, final twist of Croft's psychological manipulation. They were met with slammed doors and hung-up phones. Eleanor began to fear that this part of their plan was impossible, that Croft had buried his crimes too deep in the guilt of his victims. But then, they found one. An elderly farming couple in rural Iowa. They had sold 100 acres of their family's land that had been in their family for generations, to buy a lifetime supply of Croft's blessed water for their daughter, who was battling leukemia. She had died 6 months later, and the bank had foreclosed on the rest of their farm. Eleanor and Ben drove 12 hours to meet them. They sat in a small, immaculately clean but threadbare living room, surrounded by faded photographs of a smiling young woman. The couple, with a quiet, devastating dignity, told their story. They didn't cry. Their grief was a thing of stone, worn smooth by time and sorrow. They showed Eleanor the letters their daughter had written in her final weeks, filled with a desperate, heartbreaking faith in the miracle that was never coming. As Eleanor listened, she saw her own story reflected in their tired eyes. She saw Charles's face in the pictures of their daughter. She was not an isolated victim. She was part of a vast, invisible community of the bereaved, a silent army of souls that Julian Croft had created. The farmer's wife gave Eleanor a small framed photo of her daughter. "Show them her face," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Show them who he really steals from." That one testimony was the key. Armed with the farmer's story, Ben was able to convince another family to speak, and then another. It was a domino effect of shared grief. They recorded the interviews, capturing the quiet, undeniable power of their stories. A single mother in Detroit who had spent her son's college fund on divine healing sessions for her MS. A retired teacher in Florida who had cashed in his pension for a pilgrimage to Croft's headquarters. Each story was a unique tragedy, but they all shared a common, poisonous thread that led directly back to Julian Croft. Ben edited the testimonies into a short, powerful montage, intercutting the grieving faces of the families, with images of Croft stepping out of his private jet and waving from the balcony of his seaside mansion. It was a visceral, gut-wrenching piece of journalism, a weapon far more powerful than any spreadsheet or lab report. Just as they were compiling their final arsenal of evidence, an alert flashed on Ben's computer. It was a press release from Croft Ministries. In 2 days, Julian Croft would be holding a major press conference at his global headquarters. The topic: to address the slanderous, demonic attacks against his ministry and to announce a new, multi-billion-dollar charitable foundation for global health. Eleanor read the announcement, and a cold, clear understanding washed over her. Croft was not retreating. He was doubling down. He was going to use their attack to launch his biggest fundraising campaign yet, painting himself as a persecuted saint and turning his own scandal into a source of profit. It was a move of supreme, unadulterated arrogance. He was so convinced of his own power, of his ability to control the narrative, that he was building his own stage for his own execution. He was handing them the perfect venue, a global media spotlight, and a live audience. The final 48 hours were a blur of focused, relentless preparation. The war room in Eleanor's apartment was a hive of activity. Ben worked his contacts, securing 2 press credentials for the conference, one for himself and one for Eleanor. under the guise of being his, quote, technical consultant. Eleanor, meanwhile, took all their disparate pieces of evidence and began to weave them into a single, inescapable narrative. She arranged the lab reports, the financial charts showing the flow of money from donations to offshore accounts, and the video testimonies into a seamless, logical progression. She was not just a chemist anymore. She was a prosecutor building an airtight case. She rehearsed her presentation, not memorizing a script, but internalizing the facts until they were a part of her, her voice calm, steady, and precise. There would be no shouting, no emotional outbursts. She would dismantle his empire with the cold, clean tools of science and truth, honoring Charles's memory not with tears, but with data. On the morning of the press conference, Eleanor stood before the small, cracked mirror in her bathroom. She looked at the woman staring back at her, a woman she barely recognized from the grieving, invisible shell who had walked into that auditorium what felt like a lifetime ago. The weariness was still there, etched into the lines around her eyes, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard layer of resolve. She took out a small, framed photograph of Charles from her nightstand, the one from their university days. He was smiling, his eyes full of life and a belief in a world that made sense, a world where truth mattered. She looked from his face to her own reflection. The quiet pharmacist was gone forever. Dr. Eleanor Vance was back. She was not just seeking justice for her husband. She was going to restore, for one brilliant, shining moment, the world he had believed in. The stage was set, the evidence was prepared, and the prophet Slysom had no idea that judgment was coming for him, not from the heavens, but from the upper balcony. The press conference was held in the grand atrium of the Croft Ministries global headquarters, a soaring monument of glass and white marble designed to inspire awe and convey a sense of untouchable celestial power. Sunlight streamed through a cathedral-like ceiling, glinting off a 40-foot golden sculpture of an angel with its wings outstretched, a silent, gaudy testament to the ministry's immense wealth. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the low, predatory hum of the assembled media. Dozens of cameras were arranged in a semicircle, their lenses like a firing squad of black, unblinking eyes, all aimed at a polished mahogany podium. Eleanor Vance sat in the third row, a small, still point in the swirling chaos. She wore a simple, dark gray suit, a uniform of quiet professionalism that made her almost invisible. Ben Carter sat beside her, his leg bouncing with a nervous energy that she did not share. Inside Eleanor there was no storm. There was only a profound and unnerving calm, the placid surface of a deep ocean before a tsunami. She felt the weight of the printed lab reports in her briefcase, the cool plastic of the USB drive in her pocket. They were not just pieces of evidence. They were the concentrated mass of a decade of grief, now honed into a weapon of absolute precision. Her heart did not race. It beat with the slow, steady rhythm of a clock, counting down the final seconds of Julian Croft's reign. Julian Croft made his entrance not from the side, but through a pair of massive, ornate doors at the back of the atrium, forcing the entire press corps to turn and watch his procession. He walked down the central aisle, flanked by a phalanx of grim-faced lawyers and aides, his expression a carefully crafted mask of sorrowful resilience. He was playing the part of the persecuted saint, a man of God weathering a storm of lies sent by the devil himself. His suit was a brilliant, immaculate white, a deliberate choice to project an aura of purity and innocence. He ascended the stage, stood behind the podium, and let the cacophony of camera shutters wash over him for a long, dramatic moment. He bowed his head as if in silent prayer before looking up, his eyes sweeping across the room with a look of pained sincerity. He began to speak, his voice the same rich, hypnotic baritone, but now laced with a tremor of manufactured vulnerability. He spoke of the burdens of leadership, of the vicious, unfounded attacks that come for any man who dares to do the Lord's work. He spoke of the poor, confused woman who had disrupted his service, and he asked his followers and the media to pray for her tormented soul. Then came the masterstroke of his arrogance. He announced the formation of the Croft Global Health Foundation, a new multi-billion-dollar charity to bring healing to the world, a grand gesture of benevolence designed to make any accusations against him seem petty and absurd in comparison. He was about to open the floor to questions, a confident, magnanimous smile already forming on his lips, when Ben Carter shot to his feet. He didn't wait to be called on. His voice, sharp and clear, cut through the room. "Mr. Croft, Ben Carter from the Chronicle. Before you tell us about your new foundation, could you first tell us about your old one, Sacred Provisions, LLC?" The name hung in the air, an alien phrase in this temple of faith. Croft's smile faltered for a microsecond. A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly masked, appeared in his eyes. He had not expected a specific, technical question. He had prepared for theological debates and questions about his character. His lawyers shifted uneasily. "I'm not familiar with that particular entity," Croft said, his voice smooth as silk, a flawless, practiced lie. "Our ministry has many partners in its global mission." Ben did not back down. "My sources show that Sacred Provisions LLC is a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands that you use to purchase industrial chemicals. My technical consultant on this story, Dr. Eleanor Vance, has a follow-up question." He gestured to Eleanor, and as if on cue, she stood up. Every camera in the room swiveled to face her. The moment had arrived. The prophet stared at her, recognition finally dawning, his face a mixture of confusion and a rising tide of pure, unadulterated rage. He was looking at the, quote, confused woman, but seeing a specter from his past, an equation he had failed to solve. Eleanor walked calmly to the press microphone set up in the aisle. She did not look at Julian Croft. She addressed the cameras, her voice steady, devoid of emotion, carrying the immense weight of scientific certainty. "My name is Dr. Eleanor Vance," she began, and in that moment, she reclaimed her title and her identity for the entire world to hear. "I hold a doctorate in organic chemistry. For 20 years, I led research at Sterling Pharmaceutical. 10 years ago, my husband Charles and I were sold a fraudulent cancer cure by Mr. Croft. 2 weeks ago, I identified that same fraudulent substance by its chemical signature during Mr. Croft's live broadcast." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out the sheaf of papers from Eris Thorne's lab. "This is a gas chromatography and mass spectrometry analysis of the Sacred Anointing Oil sold by Croft Ministries. It was performed at a certified university laboratory." She held up the first page, pointing to the graph. "As you can see, the primary component is industrial-grade mineral oil. The secondary, active component, is oleandrin, a highly toxic cardiac glycoside. It is not a holy relic, it is a cheap, dangerous poison packaged with a prayer." A wave of murmurs and frantic typing swept through the press corps. The story had just gone from a heckling incident to a federal crime. Julian Croft's face, projected on the massive screens behind the stage, had turned a deathly pale. "This is absurd. This is a fabrication," he stammered, his voice losing its resonant power, becoming thin and reedy. "Security, remove this woman. She is trespassing." But no one moved. The media smelled blood, and they were not about to let their story be taken away. Eleanor ignored him, her focus absolute. "The scientific fraud, however, is only the beginning," she continued, her voice gaining strength. Ben Carter, from his seat, connected his laptop to the main press feed. Suddenly, the screens behind Croft, which had been showing the angelic logo of his ministry, flickered and changed. They were now filled with the complex, damning flowcharts of his financial empire. "These are the ministry's real financial records," Eleanor announced, her voice a cold, clear bell of judgment. "They show a decade-long pattern of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. You can see here how millions of dollars in tax-free donations from the sick and the desperate were funneled through the shell corporation, Sacred Provisions, used to buy the chemicals for pennies, and then sold back to the ministry at a markup of over 10,000%. The profits were not used for charity. They were wired directly to private offshore accounts in Panama and Zurich belonging to Mr. Croft. She pointed a single steady finger at the screen. That is your new jet. That is your mansion in the Bahamas. That is your art collection. It was all purchased with the last dollars of dying people. The room was in an uproar. Shouted questions and the blinding flash of cameras created a chaotic storm around the podium. Julian Croft stood frozen, a statue of disbelief, his carefully constructed world crumbling into dust around him. The mask of the prophet had been incinerated, revealing the terrified, cornered con man beneath. But Eleanor was not finished. She had one more weapon, the most powerful of all. "Data can feel abstract," she said, her voice dropping, drawing the entire room into a sudden, intense silence. "So let me show you the true price of Mr. Croft's wealth." The financial charts on the screen vanished, replaced by the gentle, smiling face of the young woman from the farm in Iowa. Then, her father appeared, his face etched with a grief so profound it felt like a physical blow. His voice, quiet and dignified, filled the atrium. "We sold our land," he said. "The land our family had worked for 100 years. He told us his blessed water would save her." The video continued, a montage of heartbroken families, of mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, each telling their own story of devastating loss and financial ruin, their quiet, tearful testimonies a sledgehammer to the foundation of Croft's empire. Julian Croft stared at the faces on the screen, the faces of the people he called his, quote, sheep, and for the first time, he looked truly, utterly terrified. These were not numbers on a spreadsheet. They were ghosts, and they had come to haunt him in front of the entire world. As the final, heartbreaking testimony faded from the screen, leaving only the image of a framed photograph of a lost son, a new figure stepped forward from the side of the room. He was a man in an impeccably tailored, expensive suit, his face a mask of cold, professional fury. "Mr. Croft," he began, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "My name is Marcus Thorne, and I am legal counsel for Mr. Don Moretti and his family." The mention of the Mafia boss sent a fresh shockwave through the room. "My client was fortunate enough to seek actual medical care and has since discovered the fraudulent nature of your so-called anointing oil. As of 10 minutes ago, we have filed a multi-billion-dollar civil suit against you and Croft Ministries for fraud and endangerment. Furthermore," he continued, holding up his phone, "we have provided the U.S. Attorney's Office with a full record of the offshore accounts you attempted to use to bribe my client into silence. They found the evidence of wire fraud to be most compelling." Just as he finished speaking, the main doors of the atrium burst open. This time, it was not Julian Croft making a grand entrance. It was a team of a dozen FBI agents, their blue jackets a stark, brutal contrast to the white marble and gold of the room. They moved with a quiet, deadly efficiency, their target clear. Julian Croft's face collapsed, the last vestiges of his power and arrogance evaporating in a single, silent scream. He was no longer a prophet, he was just a man, a thief whose time had finally run out. What was the most satisfying moment of Julian Croft's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. The empire imploded with a speed and finality that was breathtaking. Julian Croft was arrested live on television, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and terror, as agents snapped handcuffs onto his wrists. The image of the prophet Sessions being led away in disgrace became an iconic symbol of justice, played on a loop on every news channel for weeks. His ministry was declared a criminal enterprise, its assets frozen, its gilded temples shuttered and seized by federal marshals. The financial records Eleanor and Ben had uncovered led to a global investigation, revealing a web of corruption that ensnared bankers, politicians, and other so-called spiritual leaders. The trial was a media spectacle, but the outcome was never in doubt. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, the lab reports, the financial trail, and the devastating testimonies of his victims, Croft was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in federal prison, destined to spend the rest of his days in a small, concrete cell, a world away from the palaces his lies had built. The money recovered from his offshore accounts, hundreds of millions of dollars, was placed into a restitution fund for the thousands of families he had defrauded. It could never bring back their loved ones, but it was a tangible acknowledgement of their pain, a form of justice they had never thought possible. Eleanor Vance did not watch the trial. She had already played her part. In the aftermath of the press conference, she was hailed as a hero, a quiet, unassuming woman who had single-handedly toppled a titan. She was inundated with interview requests and book deals, offers of fame and fortune that she politely but firmly declined. That was never what she wanted. She had not sought a spotlight. She had sought the truth. Her quiet life was gone, but instead of returning to the shadows, she stepped into a new kind of light. A prestigious nonprofit consumer protection group in Washington, D.C., offered her a position to create and lead a new division, one dedicated to investigating and exposing scientific and medical fraud. It was a chance not just to reclaim her career, but to transform her personal tragedy into a public service, to use her brilliant mind to protect others from the predators who prey on desperation. She accepted. She moved to a small apartment in the city, and for the first time in 10 years, she began to set up a new life, one defined not by what she had lost, but by what she could now give. She named the new division the Charles Vance Initiative for Scientific Integrity. It was a living memorial, a legacy of truth built in honor of the man who had always believed in it. Her work was relentless and vital. She and her team of dedicated scientists, investigators, and lawyers went after the modern-day snake oil salesmen, the purveyors of fake cancer cures, the anti-science gurus who profited from fear and misinformation. She became a powerful, respected voice of reason in a world filled with noise, her quiet, data-driven authority far more compelling than the loudest charlatan. She testified before Congress, helped draft new legislation to protect consumers, and developed educational programs to teach people how to identify fraudulent claims. She was not just a chemist anymore. She was a guardian, a protector of the vulnerable, turning her grief into a shield for countless others. Her life had come full circle, from a place of profound, private despair to one of profound, public purpose. One evening, standing on the balcony of her new apartment and looking out at the lights of the Capitol, she took out the small, framed photograph of Charles. She looked at his smiling, hopeful face, the face of the man she had loved, the man whose memory had been the fuel for her impossible fight. A sense of peace, a feeling that had been absent for a decade, settled over her. She had not brought him back, but she had honored him in the most profound way imaginable. She had restored the world he believed in, a world where facts mattered, where integrity was rewarded, and where the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried, could rise up and change everything. Her journey had begun in the darkness of a single, devastating loss, but it had ended here, in the light, where his legacy was no longer just a memory, but a living, breathing force for good in the world. Dr. Eleanor Vance had found her cure, not in a bottle of poison, but in the unshakable power of the truth. If Eleanor Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.